Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Here's something that might make you pause a bit. Since cannabis was legalized up in Canada, emergency rooms have actually seen, well, more people coming in showing signs of psychosis. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, is there a real biological thing happening, a direct link between, using cannabis and this increased risk?
That's exactly the question. A really interesting new study decided to tackle. So for this deep dive, we're looking at a health news report, but also digging into the original scientific paper itself. It was published in JAMA Psychiatry, the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry.
Okay, JAMA Psychiatry, pretty serious source.
Definitely. And they've used some, pretty cutting-edge brain scanning tech to really explore this potential connection.
Right. So our goal today, basically, is to break down what this research actually found and, what it might mean for you, for listeners. We'll try to cut through the really dense scientific language and just focus on the key points.
Makes sense.
So let's dive in. The study itself, what were the researchers really trying to figure out? What was the core purpose?
Okay, so the main goal was to understand the biological mechanism, the how, that might link frequent long-term cannabis use, what doctors call cannabis use disorder, with psychosis.
Right. Cannabis use disorder, not just casual use.
Exactly. Frequent problematic use. And they specifically wanted to see if a common change in the brain's dopamine system. Dopamine's a really crucial brain chemical, right? If a change there plays a role in both cannabis use disorder and psychosis. And importantly, they wanted to know if this change shows up in people with cannabis use disorder, even if they don't also have a diagnosis like first episode schizophrenia.
Okay, so looking for a shared biological marker, something involving dopamine that links the two conditions, or maybe even just links cannabis use disorder to psychosis risk. How did they actually, look inside the brain to see this? What were the methods?
They use a really interesting technique. It's a non-invasive brain imaging method called neuromelanin-sensitive magnetic resonance imaging, or NMMRI for short.
Neuromelanin-sensitive MRI. Okay. What does that actually show?
Well, think of it like this. Neuromelanin is a kind of pigment. It gets left behind when brain cells that use dopamine are really active over time. So high dopamine activity leaves more of this pigment. And this pigment, neuromelanin, it actually shows up as darker areas on these special MRI scans. So the darker spots act as a kind of marker, showing where there's been higher dopamine turnover or activity.
I see. So more darkness equals potentially more dopamine activity in that spot.
Exactly. And the study specifically focused on two areas deep in the midbrain. The Substantia nigra and a ventral tegmental area, or VTA.
Okay, Substantia, Nigra, and VTA. Why those areas?
Because they are known to be really crucial hubs for dopamine and are strongly implicated in the development of psychosis. That's where researchers often look when studying psychosis.
Got it. So looking for these dark spots, these dopamine markers, in key psychosis-related brain regions, who actually took part in this study? Who were the participants?
Yeah, they recruited 61 people, all adults between 18 and 35. And the group was structured pretty carefully. It included people with cannabis use disorder and people without it.
Right.
And then within each of those groups, some people also had a diagnosis of first episode schizophrenia, while others didn't.
Okay, so you've got 4 basic groups. Controls, cannabis use disorder only, schizophrenia only, and then both cannabis use disorder and schizophrenia.
Precisely. It allows for comparisons. They recruited them from an early psychosis service and also just the general community there in London, Ontario.
Right, okay. A well-designed setup to try and untangle these links. So they did the scans, they analyzed the data. What were the main findings? What did they actually discover?
They found some really interesting things. First, people with cannabis use disorder, whether they also had schizophrenia or not, showed an increase in neuromelanin. So those darker spots indicating higher dopamine levels. This increase was seen in both the Substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental areas compared to people who didn't have cannabis use disorder.
So right off the bat, a connection between that pattern cannabis use and higher dopamine markers in those key areas.
Yes, that was a pretty clear initial finding. And second, they look even closer at a specific sub-region within those areas.
Okay.
A part of the Substantia nigra and VTA that previous research had already linked to how severe untreated psychosis can be. And in that specific sub-region, people with cannabis use disorder also had higher neuromelanin signals.
Wow, so not just generally higher dopamine markers, but higher in a spot specifically tied to the severity of psychosis symptoms. That's quite specific.
It is. It adds another layer, and
Yeah.
there's more. They also found what they called a dose-dependent association,
Dose-dependent meaning.
meaning the more severe someone's reported symptoms of cannabis use disorder were, like how much trouble it was causing them, how hard it was to control, the higher the neuromelanin signal, the dopamine marker was in these psychosis-related brain regions.
Okay, so it suggests a kind of gradient. More problematic use, potentially a stronger biological signal in these areas.
Exactly. It seems to strengthen that link, doesn't it? It suggests the level of use or the severity of the disorder really matters biologically.
Yeah, it does. Now, what about the group who only had first episode schizophrenia without the cannabis use disorder? How did their scans look?
That's another really interesting part. The participants with just first episode schizophrenia, they actually did not show that same significant increase in the neuromelanin signal compared to the control group.
Really? So their dopamine markers in those regions weren't significantly elevated in the same way?
Not in this study, no. It suggests that the elevated neuromelanin signal they observed might be more specifically linked to the cannabis use disorder itself, rather than just being a general feature of having schizophrenia, at least in this participant group.
Huh. That's a really important distinction. It kind of hints that maybe the dopamine changes they saw are potentially being driven or at least significantly influenced by the heavy cannabis use.
It certainly points in that direction. Of course, we need to be careful, but that's what the data seems to suggest here.
Okay, so let's talk about the implications then. Why does this research matter? What should people take away from these findings?
Well, it's pretty significant because this study offers, direct biological evidence. It connects cannabis use disorder to increased dopamine activity, right, in the brain regions we know are involved in psychosis.
Right.
The researchers themselves pointed out that this kind of direct biological line, cannabis use disorder, dopamine changes in these specific regions, psychosis risk, it hasn't really been shown this clearly before using this technique.
So it provides a potential how, a biological mechanism.
Exactly. It starts to paint a clearer picture of how frequent cannabis use might interact with brain chemistry in a way that's relevant to mental health, specifically psychosis risk.
And just to remind ourselves, why is too much dopamine or increased activity a concern when we talk about psychosis?
Well, dopamine is crucial for lots of things, like motivation, reward, movement, but also how we perceive reality and process information. And excess of dopamine activity, particularly in certain pathways, can kind of disrupt normal brain communication.
Disrupt how?
It can make signals too strong or noisy, potentially leading to the kinds of symptoms we see in psychosis, like hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking. It's like turning the volume up too high on certain brain circuits, leading to a distorted experience.
Okay, so the idea is that frequent cannabis use might be, in a way, pushing the dopamine system in these key areas towards a state that makes psychosis more likely, especially for people who might already be vulnerable.
That's a good way to think about it. The study's findings really support this idea of cannabis potentially affecting what scientists sometimes call a final common pathway.
A final common pathway.
Yeah, the idea that maybe different things, genetics, stress, substance use, can all ultimately lead to psychosis through a similar final mechanism, often involving dopamine excess in these midbrain areas. This study suggests cannabis use disorder might tap into that same pathway.
That's a really powerful concept. It suggests cannabis isn't necessarily causing some unique, separate thing, but maybe activating a known biological route towards psychosis.
Potentially, yes. And the researchers also mentioned the implications for adolescents, which is really important.
Right. What do they say about young people?
They touched on how this might help us understand why some teenagers who have like a brief psychotic episode after using cannabis sometimes go on to develop more persistent psychotic disorders later on.
Mm-hmm.
The idea being if they continue frequent use, especially while their brain is still developing, they might be sort of nudging their brain chemistry, specifically this dopamine system, in a direction that increases long-term vulnerability.
Well, like they're pushing their brain, as one quote put it.
Exactly. It's a concerning thought. That repeated exposure during that critical developmental window could have lasting effects on these systems.
That is quite sobering, especially thinking about parents, educators, and young people themselves.
It really is. And the experts involved, they stressed how vital these findings are for clinicians, for the patients or individuals using cannabis, and for their families. Understanding these potential biological risks can lead to more informed conversations, maybe earlier intervention, better support.
More open dialogue based on, actual brain science.
Precisely.
Okay, but like with any single study, it's crucial we don't overstate things. We need to talk about the limitations, right? What things should we keep in mind?
Absolutely. Critical point, yes. First and foremost, while the study found this strong link, this association, it does not definitively prove that cannabis use causes psychosis.
Right. Correlation isn't causation.
Exactly. Establishing direct cause and effect is way more complex. It shows an association with a biological marker, this neuromelanin signal, that's related to dopamine and psychosis risk. But we can't say for 100% certainty, based just on this, that the cannabis caused the change or that the change will cause psychosis. There could be other factors involved.
Okay, that's number one. What else?
Well, the sample size. 61 participants is decent for this kind of intensive brain imaging study, but it's still, relatively modest in the grand scheme of things. And the follow-up part, where they looked at changes over a year, that involved an even smaller subset of participants. This limited their statistical power to detect maybe smaller or slower changes in neuromelanin over time.
So the long-term picture is still a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, we need larger, longer studies to really confirm how these markers might change over years or with changes in cannabis use.
And you mentioned the participant group earlier. Were there any imbalances or specific characteristics we should note?
Yes, the researchers did point out that female participants were underrepresented in their sample. So we don't know for sure if these exact same findings would hold true in a study with more women. Biological sex can influence brain chemistry, so it's something to consider.
Good point. What about the brain regions they looked at? Was it comprehensive?
They focused specifically on the Substantia nigra and the VTA, because those are the big players linked to dopamine and psychosis. Makes sense. But they didn't collect data on other brain areas that also have neuromelanin, like a place called the locus coeruleus, which is more involved in stress and arousal. So the findings are specific to the regions they studied.
Okay. And one other really important one you hinted at earlier, the fact that the people with schizophrenia were receiving treatment.
Yes, that's a major caveat. The participants with first episode schizophrenia were quite rightly getting treatment. This often includes antipsychotic medications,
which directly affect dopamine.
Exactly. Antipsychotics generally work by blocking dopamine receptors or reducing dopamine activity. So it's entirely possible that the medication these individuals were taking influenced the neuromelanin levels the researchers measured. It might have lowered their signal.
Which could potentially make the difference between them and the cannabis use disorder group look bigger than it might otherwise be.
It's possible. It complicates the interpretation of the schizophrenia-only group's results compared to the others. The researchers acknowledge this limitation clearly.
Okay. Those are all really important points for context. Thanks for laying those out. Now, what about the experts themselves, the authors, other researchers involved? What did they emphasize about what this all means?
Lena Polani-Appin, who is the senior author, really stressed the need for collaboration. She talked about clinicians, patients, the people using cannabis, and their families needing to work together.
To do what?
Her words were about breaking this line. The line their research suggests connects cannabis use, dopamine changes, and psychosis risk. She sees it as needing a joined-up effort for education, awareness, and support strategies.
So taking this biological insight and translating it into real-world action.
Exactly. And another researcher, Betsy Schaefer, echoed that. She highlighted how this work helps clarify the underlying biology, which is crucial for public health awareness, especially, post-legalization, where cannabis is more available and may be perceived as less risky by some.
Right. Understanding the how helps inform the what should we do about it.
And Jessica Aarons, the first author, she expressed hope that these findings would empower people.
Empower them how?
By giving both individuals and their healthcare providers a clearer picture of the potential downsides of frequent use. She hoped it would also encourage doctors to offer, alternative coping strategies or resources if people are maybe using cannabis to self-medicate other issues.
Thinking more holistically about why someone might be using cannabis heavily.
Yes. And another professor involved, Ali Khan, he brought it back to the clinical reality. He noted seeing more adolescents with cannabis-induced psychosis. He felt this study provides important biological evidence that's useful when counseling young people about the potential long-term brain effects.
Having that scientific backing for those difficult conversations.
It can make a difference, perhaps. And just to kind of wrap up their main conclusion, The research team stated pretty clearly that they found elevated dopamine function, shown by the neuromelanin signal in this key midbrain region, seems associated with psychosis risk in people with cannabis use disorder.
Okay.
And that cannabis seems linked to this hypothesized final common pathway for psychotic symptoms.
So putting it all together from this deep dive, what's the main message, the key takeaway for someone listening, and maybe what should they think about doing?
I think the core takeaway is this. This study adds compelling new evidence, biological evidence, suggesting a link between frequent problematic cannabis use disorder and changes in the brain's dopamine system, specifically in areas tied to psychosis. It gives us a deeper understanding of that relationship. So based on that, we'd really encourage listeners to think about the potential impact frequent cannabis use might have on their brain, their mental well-being. It's not necessarily about scaring everyone about any use, but about understanding the specific risks tied to heavy, regular patterns, especially if someone feels they might be vulnerable.
Right, and if someone is concerned, either about themselves or someone they know.
Then the clear advice is, please seek out reliable information and definitely talk to healthcare professionals, your doctor, a therapist, a mental health service.
Don't just rely on, anecdotes or stuff online.
Exactly. Professionals can give personalized advice, offer support, and connect you to the right resources. It's about having informed, open conversations and getting help if you need it.
Makes perfect sense. Making informed choices, seeking help when needed.
Precisely. And one last thing to maybe reflect on. How does this growing understanding of the biology, this link between cannabis and dopamine and psychosis risk, how should that influence not just our personal choices, but maybe broader conversations in society, especially around young people whose brains are still developing?
Yeah, that's a big question.
It is.
So just to summarize then, this new research really strengthens the case for a potential biological connection. Cannabis use disorder seems linked to higher dopamine activity in key brain areas associated with psychosis. It deepens our understanding significantly.
It does. And that leads perfectly into our final thought for listeners to mull over. With this kind of biological evidence emerging, how should we, as individuals, as a society, maybe reevaluate how we think about and approach cannabis use, particularly for adolescents and young adults? And what other questions does this research spark for you about the amazing complexity of the brain and our mental health?
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.